Hi, hello, it's Ro, welcome back. So the last time I posted one of these top 10 book videos was in 2021. So I think it's time to give it an update and a refresh. So the last one I was just kind of out of masters and just started working. And so if you're looking for like my all-time favorites out of like high school, undergraduate study, postgraduate study, and just like really core books that I love and I still love, then I'd recommend you go and watch that one first. The ones since then, like the 10 I have today, are a bit more eclectic. They're from kind of different areas of psychology and a bit more niche, but yeah, I'd say watch that first and then come back to this one. If you guys are new here, I'm a clinical psychologist and I post weekly videos on Thursday about like being an early career psych, psychology as an industry, science stuff. And so if you're interested in joining the community, then click subscribe. Alrighty, let's get into it. So the first book is, these are all on my Kindle. The first book is Maybe You Should Talk to Someone by Lori Gottlieb, published in 2019. And she is a therapist, and the book talks about her journey going through therapy as well as her own therapy cases. So I reckon this is a really, really good read. What's really great is you see a therapist on both sides of the chair, and I'm such a big supporter for all psych students and people who want to become therapists to get their own therapy. And I've made a video about 5 reasons why it actually makes you a better therapist. So she talks about she's going through like a separation, she has a child, is going through a lot of grief, and she talks about the process of her friends actually pushing her to go to therapy. And her therapist is like named Wendell and is this really cool dude. And then alongside that story of her own transformation, she talks about her practice and 4 pretty interesting kind of case studies of how she works with them and how their lives go. And so I think as any psych student, early career psychologist, I highly, highly recommend it. It made me cry, it made me laugh. It's an awesome book. Number 2 is Hidden Valley Road by Robert Kolker, and it details the journey of a family with schizophrenia, essentially. And the Galvin family is one of the most kind of influential families or case studies in the field of mental health relating to schizophrenia, because so the parents actually had maybe like 7 or 8 children, and most of them ended up presenting with schizophrenia, but also at different times, at different ages, and the type of schizophrenia presented differently as well. So in terms of like a case study for medical professionals, the Galvins were really, really important in understanding schizophrenia, because our understanding of it is still changing. And certainly back in that time, we didn't really know what to do with it. It was still the very early stages of antipsychotics. And it's, to be honest, it's pretty heartbreaking. A lot of the, kids, and then they turn into adults, they do go through a lot of difficulties because no one really knew what the supports were. But if you are interested in schizophrenia, if you're interested in the development of it, if you're interested in hearing about how different people can have maybe the genetic underpinnings for schizophrenia, but then also knowing that how their innate personality and their early relationships and the way that they bonded with each other, like, if they were friends with each other, it was a protective factor. If there was like this early kind of aggressive streak, that was not a good sign for later independence and ability. And then also knowing about how the early treatments, like that kind of like electroconvulsive therapy, shocking the brain, that kind of thing, wasn't maybe so helpful. And it just kind of explores schizophrenia from the perspective of a family and all the different characters, as opposed to maybe reading it in a textbook. And I highly recommend for anyone who might be working with schizophrenic patients or just interested in learning more. And it's humanizing, which I think is the most important thing. Next book is Things I Wish I'd Known Before I Got Married by Gary Chapman, who's a relationship counselor, published in 2010. And if you've heard of the 5 love languages, this is the guy who developed that. And that is integrated into the book, but there's also other stuff. And the idea is so many of us are born kind of thinking about relationships as this like happy ending story, as if you love someone, you're going to feel that for ages. And he really breaks down a lot of that myth, fairy tale stuff and talks about what's the reality of getting married and what it's like working with couples and marriage counseling and the difficulties that they go through. And there's little things like understanding that that feeling of love and that like happy, excited feeling isn't going to be around forever. And I think this is something that even now, like I look on social media and it's all these like couple channels and you just kind of feel like, oh, look, they're married and they're having so much fun together. And it must be that love means that you have to be super excited and feel it and really attracted all the time. He looks onto the other side, which is kind of like the real side, not the social media polished, like, have an aim kind of side. And I think it's a very calming book for me because it kind of went, oh, I don't have to live up to this expectation. And then he also gives some really practical strategies for how to actually work on relationships and how to support your partner and how to ask for a partner to support you the way that you want to. So yeah, really, really good book. And I think you can read it honestly when you're young. It doesn't have to be when you're just about to get married. Third book is Mating in Captivity by Esther Perel, published in 2006. And Esther Perel is one of my all-time favorite therapists. She has a podcast called Where Should We Begin about couples counseling. She has a really amazing Instagram with resources. She's published a card game for how to communicate with friends and families and on a deeper level. And she has such a wonderful way of delivering therapy. I highly recommend her podcast, by the way. And this book in particular is, again, breaking down some stereotypes about relationships, and particularly on the subject of desire and sexual desire, arousal, intimacy. And what's really interesting is she talks about the interplay of intimacy and closeness and love and familiarity and safety, and how sometimes that can actually be the opposite of that feeling of lust and desire and chase. And that's so tricky because in modern romantic relationships, you're supposed to have someone who's your best friend, your safety net, but then also have this huge thirst for them and desire all the time. And she says that those two energies are often paradoxical and it's hard to actually have them at the same time. And so she talks about lots of different case studies of different relationship styles and different couples that she's worked with, but also about how to sometimes artificially, I guess, create a sense of independence from a partner in order to increase desire if that is a goal. And I found it really, really interesting personally because I've personally struggled with this idea of sometimes when I feel really comfortable with a partner, the desire and that kind of initial feeling of attraction can fade a tiny bit and it turns into a different type of attraction of oh, I just love this person so much as a person. But yeah, how to balance those two things, especially in a long-term relationship. That's a really interesting book. I highly recommend. Book number 5 is So Much I Want to Tell You by Anna Okana, published in 2017. If that name rings a bell, it's because Anna Okana has a huge YouTube channel and I really love her content. She does a lot of stuff about, so I went to therapy and this is what I learned. And it's really relatable. It's really funny. And this book is about her losing her sister to suicide and the journey of grief and learning to separate from the sense of responsibility, her own therapeutic journey, and such a really poignant depiction of grief, I think. And she is also a comedian. And so you've got this kind of dark humor approach to it, which is really interesting because actually you'll find psychologists and medical professionals, when you're faced with so much darkness, people do actually end up developing this weird kind of humor. If everything becomes incredibly dark all the time, it's just hard to cope. It's the type of book you pick up and you bawl like crazy, but then also it makes you laugh sometimes. So I think it's just a great book for understanding what it's like to live with suicide, understanding what it's like to go through therapy and have someone who's very, very psychologically minded write the book and through her lens. And yeah, what it's like to have family members who are left behind and who are then struggling with their own mental health. And she's a woman born from an Asian family as well and went into the arts. And so you'll also hear a bit about what it's like to navigate in that type of environment. Next is Who Ordered This Truckload of Dung by Ajahn Brahm, published 2005. And this is a bit of a curveball because this is not a psychology science book. It's more of a spirituality kind of book. I'm personally Buddhist and Ajahn Brahm is a Theravadan Buddhist monk. And Theravadan Buddhism is basically the broken down version of Buddhism. There's not too many rituals or there's no real kind of magical belief around it, but it talks a lot about mindfulness, talks a lot about kindness, talks a lot about changing our perspective. And so actually it kind of helped inform, at the time of life when I read it, I was pretty overwhelmed and stressed out. And he uses these little parables or little fun stories, almost as if you could tell a child. But at the end of it, there's always a strong message, and it could be about mindfulness business. It could be about the way that we compare ourselves. It could be about how we see mistakes in a world of good. And it's just a really kind of uplifting, funny, the stories are really sweet. And I just remember the way that I was reading this book was every single day I would read one story. I think I would almost start the day off like on the train or something. I'd read one short story and that would kind of be a little bit of like my intention or my approach for the day. And it's such a great book just if you're going through a rough time. It's also interesting if you want like kind of like a nice intro to what Buddhism is, if you want a bit of background to our therapies. So for instance, acceptance commitment therapy is very open about how they're based off or draw from Eastern philosophies, and I think DBT as well with their mindfulness and understanding suffering. So yeah, that was just a really fun, uplifting book for me. Next, Single on Purpose by John Kim, published 2020. So I read this after my breakup. I was just trying to search for like breakup books. John Kim is a licensed marriage or like couples counselor, and he has this explosive Instagram and it's kind of gone viral, but he's known for his like really non-traditional approach to therapy. He does therapy in cafes while walking up and down the beach. He as a therapist is so authentic and open, and I'm pretty inspired by him in the sense of being a therapist on social media is really uncomfortable. It took me a long time to actually start the channel because it's so drilled into us in our training, like, you know, you are a blank slate, the client is the focus, you know, you have no personality kind of, or like when we talked about showing personality, it was like, oh, you can express it maybe in your clothing. But he's so authentic. He shares who his wife is. He shares photos of his kids. He shares when he's going through ups and downs. He shares his workout routine. And he talks about things in such an honest, open way that it feels much more peer-to-peer than like therapist to client. This particular book is about what it was like for him, learnings, that kind of stuff, his journey, about when he went through a divorce. But mainly it's a kind of an advice book on what to do when you break up, or how it can be really, really good to be single and to actually focus on ourselves. And he talks a lot about how he was relationship jumping for much of his life. And finally, when he was single or like forced to be single after a pretty messy divorce, actually that's when he got the time and space, focus on himself and to work on himself. So if you're looking for a bit of motivation, if you've gone through a breakup, I think this is an excellent book. And also, again, it's from the perspective of a therapist. And if you want, you can follow he's got a podcast as well as an Instagram, and they're both really fun. He is a little bit interesting. And so sometimes you'll watch some stuff and you'll go like, oh my gosh, he has the gall to post this. But yeah, he's totally an inspiration for me. Next, Come As You Are by Emily Nagoski in 2015. So this, I think, is such an important book because it debunks so much about sex, desire, about orgasms, about the kind of stuff that we don't really talk about. And I understand that it's not a traditional psychology book, but if you ever become a therapist, you're going to talk so much about relationships and so much about, well, we dance around sometimes, but it really is very important to learn a bit more about sex and desire. And I actually read this book probably straight after I filmed the last video, so I don't have the clearest memory of it, but it's an incredibly scientific, well-researched book, and it's well-referenced by a lot of sex therapists as well. And the bit that I remember most was about how during a sexual assault, women might actually experience physical arousal and how that can actually be used against them in court, because people can say, oh, well, you were physically aroused. And so, you know, obviously you wanted it. And she talks about how our brain and our body can be on different pathways, and it can also be different based on if you're a woman or a man. And it really is very, very interesting because I see a lot of clients, women who maybe have had difficult sexual experiences, and there's a lot of self-blame and self-doubt. And so when you present them with the science, it can be incredibly powerful. And I have used stuff from this in my sessions before. If you want a super scientific look into arousal, orgasm, sexuality, I think it's such an amazing book to read. And I think it really should be incorporated into like high school sex ed for every single person to understand some of this stuff. It's probably going to be a book that I'm going to reread soon. Number 9 is The Explosive Child by Dr. Ross Greene, published in a long time ago. It was 1998. Dr. Ross Greene is a really, really well-known therapist, child therapist, and the model that he developed was called Collaborative and Proactive Solutions, or CPS. The reason I read this book is because it's kind of like the self-help or the intro book to the training manual that I was kind of diving into a little bit. CPS is a unique approach to child therapy because it basically has this idea that CPS is unique in child therapy because it has this underlying belief of children do well when they can. And it's such an affirming, strengths-based kind of book because it says if children are misbehaving, if they're not emotionally regulating, if they're not kind of fitting in, that it's not about how do we make them or motivate them, which has been the very traditional idea of parenting about like, okay, well, if you don't do it, then I'm going to give you a consequence so I can make you want to. This talks about how maybe people don't have the skills to. And so if a child isn't regulating well and they're hitting people at school, they don't have the skill to calm down enough so that they can avoid that. Or if a child is really aggressive after we tell them to turn the computer off, maybe the child doesn't have the skills to communicate how they want more time in a healthy way. It's such a lovely shift in perspective if you want to do child therapy. And I think it's a really great read for parents as well, and just anyone who wants to work with children and families. I much prefer these kinds of new like attachment-based, strengths-based views on child therapy compared to some of our these more like consequence, punishment type base. I really like this type of view. Like there's a couple of different types of therapy, PCIT, CPS, that explore more of this strengths-based focus on children rather than taking the inherent assumption that they're just being disrespectful and just not motivated to be respectful and stuff like that. Also quite a practical book. So pretty much every therapist who was working on CPS in our clinic also was reading this book as well. So it kind of honestly is a tiny bit training manually. It's very practical. And last book is Essentialism by Greg McKeown in 2014. So he is actually a businessman and he graduated from, I think it was Stanford with an MBA. The reason I put this book in this list, even though obviously he's not a psychologist, is the idea he talks about essentialism is it's a little bit of like kind of like minimalism. It's a little bit about figuring out what your values are. It's a little bit about time management, how to build the life that you want, doing what matters to you. It's informed and there are flavors of different types of therapies that we use. What's so great about it is I remember leaving this book feeling so inspired to focus on what was truly important to me. And so his whole thesis is, unless we really figure out what's super essential, and essential is not like my 10 essentials, it's like what is like your one essential. What do you have to have? And then what's your second thing that you have to have if you had nothing else? And by concentrating on what's important, he says you need to start saying no to things that aren't so important. So things that don't serve you, things that you're just doing to please other people. He actually gives you a bit of a jump scare really, because he talks about how if we kind of put energy into everything, we're not good at any of those things, and the importance of really focusing in on what's important to you. I'm quite a big advocate of learning about minimalism and cutting down and getting rid of kind of the fluff, and it's something that I'm still working on. And yeah, this book was really inspiring, so highly give that a read as well. Alrighty, I think that's our 10 books already. I hope those were helpful. It's a pretty eclectic bunch of books, but those were the ones that I was reading recently. I do admit, since I've been training more rigorously, I have kind of deviated my reading from popular psychology to actually primarily fantasy and like romance and memoirs, but like funny ones, not psychologist ones, because I spent all day practicing and training, and all of my site content is usually kind of like textbooks and stuff. And so I've read actually way less popular psychology, self-help type stuff. And yeah, so that's why I guess not even all of these are pure psychology books. I hope that was helpful or interesting. And yeah, I guess I'll catch you guys next Thursday. Thanks for watching. Bye.